for the failures. I remember the night that they aired Saving Chance on HBO. I said then that neither one of these wars, Iraq or Afghanistan, should have ever took place, and all the Americans and the civilians of those two countries that lost their lives, I just feel so for them. But America has got to do better. I mean, we cannot go in wars under false pretense and kill people and our own and think that we have done something glorified. This has not been a glorified 20 years in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's been a sad 20 years altogether. And what makes it so sad is it was all unnecessary. Thank you, John, for taking my call.
Gene, Detroit, Michigan, Democrat. Good morning.
Hi. I just wanted to quickly say I recently did some research and found out that the war was unnecessary in that the United States was bombing Afghanistan, trying to get the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban offered to turn over Osama bin Laden if we would stop the bombing. Bush and Rumsfeld both said no, and then we went to war. Just like we made up the excuse for going into Iraq. And there's a price to pay. I mean, war should be a last resort.
Gene, you said
I feel sorry.
You recently did some research. Where did you do some research?
Online, and I vaguely remember because I was following all this after 9/11. But I looked online, and I just put in, because I saw it in a newspaper article also. And don't ask me what newspaper it was.
All right. That's Gene in Michigan. Maybe time for one more call as we wait for this UN Security Council meeting to get underway. UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield has arrived in the room as well as Secretary General, but hasn't started yet. We'll hear from Sandra in New Orleans, Republican. Go ahead.
Okay. I would like to say to everyone who's called in about war and said that America's tired of wars. America started off, the United States did, with the Revolutionary War. Okay, we took over the Native Americans' lands. We have done a lot of sins, but it is stupid to think that this world or the United States of America will ever have peace. There's always going to be wars. And the other thing, the presence in Afghanistan gave us intelligence about Iran, China, Russia, and so many other of our enemies. Third point, how long have we been in Germany? We rebuilt Germany. They were our enemies. Okay, how long have we been in Japan and still forking money over there? You know why? Because in South Korea, because we need a presence over there so we can gather intelligence.
Sandra, we'll have to end it there. This UN Security Council meeting getting underway, and we'll, of course, be back here tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Pacific on the Washington Journal.
The 8,834th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Afghanistan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Afghanistan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I would like to warmly welcome His Excellency the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and would like to give him the floor. Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, Excellencies, the world is following events in Afghanistan with a heavy heart and deep disquiet about what lies ahead. All of us have seen the images in real time: chaos, unrest, uncertainty, and fear. Much lies in the balance, the progress, the hope, the dreams of a generation of young Afghan women and girls, boys and men. At this grave hour, I urge all parties, especially the Taliban, to exercise utmost restraint to protect lives and to ensure that humanitarian needs can be met. Conflict has forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. The capital city has seen a huge influx of internally displaced persons from provinces around the country where they felt insecure or fled during fighting. I remind all parties of their obligation to protect civilians. And I call on all parties to provide humanitarians with unimpeded access to deliver timely and life-saving services and aid. And I also urge all countries to be willing to receive Afghan refugees and refrain from any deportations. Mr. President, now is the time to stand as one. The international community must be united and utilize all available instruments to ensure the following. First, we must speak with one voice to uphold human rights in Afghanistan. I call upon the Taliban and all parties to respect and protect international humanitarian law and the rights and freedoms of all persons. We are receiving chilling reports of severe restrictions on human rights throughout the country. And I am particularly concerned by accounts of mounting human rights violations against the women and girls of Afghanistan who fear a return to the darkest days. It is essential that the hard-won rights of Afghan women and girls are protected. They are looking to the international community for support, the same international community that assured them that opportunities would be expanded, education would be guaranteed, freedoms would be spread, and rights would be secured. Second, the international community must unite to make sure that Afghanistan is never again used as a platform or safe haven for terrorist organizations. I appeal to the Security Council and the international community as a whole to stand together, to work together and act together, and use all tools at its disposal to suppress the global terrorist threat in Afghanistan and to guarantee that basic human rights will be respected. Regardless of who holds power, these two fundamental principles, in which our world has such a deep and abiding interest, must be upheld. Mr. President, the United Nations is committed to supporting Afghans. We continue to have staff and offices in areas that have come under Taliban control. I am relieved to report that, in large measure, our personnel and premises have been respected. We urge the Taliban to continue to do so and to honor the integrity and inviolability of diplomatic envoys and premises. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan affects 18 million people, fully half of the country's population. It is vital that basic services continue to be provided. In a statement issued yesterday, the Taliban said that they would work with the existing institutions. It is crucial that civil servant salaries continue to be paid, infrastructure is maintained, airports are reopened, and health and education services continue. The United Nations presence will adapt to the security situation. But above all, we will stay and deliver in support of the Afghan people in their hour of need. Looking ahead, I call for an immediate end to violence, for the rights of all Afghans to be respected, and for Afghanistan to comply with all international agreements to which it is a party. Mr. President, Afghans are a proud people with a rich cultural heritage. They have known generations of war and hardship. They deserve our full support. The following days will be pivotal. The world is watching. We cannot and must not abandon the people of Afghanistan. And I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to the representative of Afghanistan. You have the floor, please.
Your Excellency, the President, Excellency, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity to speak at yet another Council meeting on the situation in Afghanistan and for India's leadership of the Council during this critical period. We welcome the convening of this emergency session of the Security Council on the situation in Afghanistan and thank all the Council members, particularly Estonia and Norway as co-pin holder of Afghanistan, for their role in organizing this session. Mr. President, today I'm speaking on behalf of millions of people in Afghanistan whose fate hangs in the balance and are faced with an extremely uncertain future. I'm speaking for millions of Afghan girls and women who are about to lose their freedom to go to school, to work, and to participate in the political, economic, and social life of the country. I'm speaking for thousands of human rights defenders, journalists, academics, civil servants, and former security personnel whose lives are at risk for defending human rights and democracy. I'm speaking for thousands of internally displaced people who are desperately in need of shelter, food, and protection in Kabul and other places. As you're witnessing yourself, the situation in Kabul, a city of about 6 million people, is extremely worrying, to say the least. You have seen chaotic scenes at the Kabul International Airport as desperate citizens are trying to leave the country. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned about Taliban's not honoring their promises and commitments made in their statements at Doha and at other international fora. We've witnessed time and again how Taliban have broken their promises and commitments in the past. We have seen gruesome images of Taliban's mass executions of military personnel and target killings of civilians in Kandahar and other big cities. Mr. President, we cannot allow this to happen in Kabul, which has been the last refuge for many people escaping violence and Taliban's revenge attacks. Kabul residents are reporting that Taliban have already started house-to-house searches in some neighborhoods, registering names and looking for people in their target list. There are already reports of target killings and looting in the city. Kabul residents are living in absolute fear right now. Mr. President, there is no time for blame game anymore. We have an opportunity to prevent further violence, prevent Afghanistan descending into a civil war and becoming a pariah state. Therefore, the Security Council and the UN Secretary General should use every means at its disposal to call for an immediate cessation of violence and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Call on the Taliban to fully respect the general amnesty offered by them, cease target killing and revenge attacks, and abide by international humanitarian laws. Urge that no public institutions and service delivery infrastructure be demolished, including works of arts in museums and media institutions. Stress that anyone violating human rights of Afghan citizens and international humanitarian law will be held accountable. Urgently establish a humanitarian corridor for the evacuation of those at risk of Taliban's retributions and attacks. Call on neighboring countries of Afghanistan to open their borders and facilitate exit of people trying to escape and entry of goods for humanitarian relief and operations. Call for the immediate establishment of an inclusive and representative transitional government that includes all ethnic groups and women representatives, which can lead to a dignified and lasting solution to the conflict, bring peace, and preserve the gains of the last 20 years, especially for women and girls. Stress that the Council and the United Nations will not recognize any administration that achieves power through force or any government that is not inclusive and representative of its diversity of the country. Unequivocally state that it does not recognize the restoration of the Islamic Emirate as reaffirmed in previous Council statement and agreements. Establish international guarantees for the implementation of a future political agreement. And finally, mobilize urgent humanitarian assistance for the 18 million people of Afghanistan, particularly those displaced by current conflict. The UN humanitarian appeal at $1.3 billion remain 40% funded. We urge the international community to meet the remainder of this life-saving appeal to provide critical aid to all internally displaced people. At the end, I would like to thank the United Nations and many other international organizations who are on the ground providing life-saving humanitarian support and monitoring human rights on the ground. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Afghanistan for his statement. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome the presence and the strong messages of the Secretary General and the representative of Afghanistan. Last week, we highlighted our grave concern that the number of civilians killed and injured in Afghanistan had reached the highest on record, with Taliban responsible for the largest share of casualties. Today, having declared control over Afghanistan, the Taliban bear even greater responsibility and accountability for the safety and security of all people in Afghanistan. Estonia calls for those in power, those in positions of authority, to adhere to international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and uphold the norms and standards on human rights. What has not changed is that more than half the population of Afghanistan is in need of humanitarian aid. It is of critical importance to ensure that humanitarian access is not hindered and that aid providers can work in safety. We call on all parties to allow immediate, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for UN humanitarian agencies and other actors providing assistance. This is the time for building, repairing, and healing, not retaliating, looting, or profiteering. It is the utmost time to establish peace. The people of Afghanistan deserve peace and security. A sustainable end to the conflict in Afghanistan can only be ensured through an inclusive political settlement that upholds the constitutional protections for the rights of all people of Afghanistan, particularly women, children, and persons belonging to minorities. Only an inclusively negotiated political solution can lead to a durable peace in the country, as well as stability in the region. Mr. President, I would like to reiterate Estonia's commitment to the people of Afghanistan. However, our cooperation with any future Afghanistan leadership will be based upon its willingness to uphold the positive achievements of recent decades and act by the norms and standards of international law, including international human rights law. Our political and financial support continues to be conditional upon the preservation of the country's human rights and democratic achievements. We welcome the efforts of Afghanistan's neighbors and partners who have offered their help by providing shelter to those escaping the dangers and the uncertainties that accompany armed conflict. I would end with a special thank you to the UN mission in Afghanistan. The efforts of the mission are now more important than ever, as is the safety and security of their staff. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you for calling this emergency meeting on the situation in Afghanistan. Allow me also to thank the Secretary General for his participation and his briefing, as well as the Ambassador Isak Tsai for his remarks. To echo the Secretary General and previous speakers, the situation in Afghanistan is extremely serious. Over the last few weeks, amidst an ongoing violent conflict, the national security and defense forces of the country collapsed almost in their entirety. Over the last 24 to 48 hours, the leadership of the central government has disintegrated. The country and its population are now facing a multi-layered crisis of very significant proportion. Suffering and hardship because of violent conflict, drought and food insecurity, and as well as the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious diseases like polio and measles. We, the Security Council and the entire international community need to show our continued commitment to them in both words and actions. In this unprecedented situation, Norway calls for an immediate end to the violence in Afghanistan, the restoration of security and civil order, and urgent talks to resolve the current crisis of constitutional authority and to arrive at a peaceful settlement. The reality the international community now must contend with is that the Taliban movement exercises de facto control over much of Afghan territory, including the capital, Kabul. We have taken careful note of the statements by Taliban representatives during the last few days. These include assurances that the security and safety of all Afghans, diplomats and humanitarian workers will be guaranteed. It has been communicated that government workers, whether military or civilian, will not face retribution of any kind. Furthermore, Taliban representatives have stated that women and girls will have access to work and education. These are encouraging words. But the Taliban will be judged not by their words, but by their actions in the days, weeks, and months ahead. How the Taliban conduct themselves in actual deed will matter a great deal in terms of whether and how the international community will be willing and able to relate to, cooperate with, and support a future new Afghan government in which the Taliban participates. Restoring law and order in Kabul must have the utmost priority. There have been disturbing reports of looting and chaos. The current situation at and around Kabul International Airport is also unclear and deeply worrying. We call on all parties to ensure that all Afghan and foreign nationals who wish to leave the country can do so in a safe and orderly way. The ongoing violence across Afghanistan, including in urban areas, has caused grave harm to civilians, especially children, as well as the abruption of services and damage to civilian infrastructure, including those providing water and sanitation, food and education, and health services. Safe access to these services must be immediately restored. We are deeply concerned about the number of reported serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses in communities affected by the ongoing armed conflict across the country, and stress the urgent and imperative need to bring the perpetrators to justice. All parties must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law in all circumstances, including those relating to the protection of civilians. A sustainable end to the conflict in Afghanistan can only be achieved through an inclusive, just, durable and realistic political settlement that upholds human rights, especially for women, children and minorities. We express our support for the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts centered on both Doha and Kabul to ensure a transition that is orderly and prevent further bloodshed. We commend the ongoing diplomatic efforts by several key stakeholders, including the United States, Qatar, and Pakistan. The future new government must be united, inclusive, representative, and participatory. It must have the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. It must adhere to Afghanistan international obligations, including with regards to respecting universal human rights. Finally, for peace builders, human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, especially the brave women who for years have stood up for their rights and demanded equal participation and say in their future, the situation feels desperate. Consistent marginalization at negotiations, as well as reprisals and targeted violence against them and their family members, draws deep concern about their safety and the goal of an inclusive political settlement. In the current situation, we, the Council and the wider international community all have a responsibility to ensure their protection and must use all means of support and diplomatic and political channels to amplify their voices and protect them from harm. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Norway for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary General Guterres, thank you for your sobering briefing and for your strong statement. Your role, along with your personal envoy, Jean Arnaud, and Special Representative Lyons and her team on the ground is especially vital now. And as we enter an uncertain and crucial period that requires the international community to speak with a clear and unified voice. The United States deeply appreciates the continued efforts of UNAMA and other UN actors on the ground in Afghanistan that are continuing to provide life-saving assistance to Afghans in need. We also thank Norway and Estonia for calling this meeting and India for convening it given the events of the past 72 hours. And we welcome the participation of Afghanistan to this meeting. Over this past weekend, members of the international community joined together to state unequivocally that every Afghan should be able to live in safety, security, and dignity. We also called on all parties in Afghanistan to ensure safe departures and the protection of human life and property. Today, I want to reiterate, reemphasize, and reassert this call. Civilian populations, including journalists and non-combatants, must be protected. Attacks against civilians or civilian objects must stop, and the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Afghan citizens, especially women, girls, and members of minority groups, must be respected. We also call on all parties to prevent terrorism, and we must all ensure Afghanistan cannot ever again be a base for terrorism. We also call on the Taliban to permit humanitarian organizations to continue their vital work in Afghanistan. In addition to the ongoing violence, the Afghan people are suffering acutely from the effects of COVID-19 and drought. These urgent humanitarian needs must remain top of mind for all of us in the coming hours, days, and weeks and beyond. Humanitarian personnel and agencies must have safe, unhindered access to provide life-saving assistance to the increasing numbers of Afghans in need. We are deeply concerned that right now aid is not flowing to people in crisis. According to the World Food Program, more than 500 tons of aid are currently sitting at border crossings taken over by Taliban forces. These aid deliveries must resume immediately, and the World Food Program must have immediate and sustained safe passage to deliver this much-needed assistance. Finally and critically, all Afghan nationals and international citizens who wish to depart must be allowed to do so safely. President Biden has made clear that any action that put U.S. personnel or our mission at risk will be met with a swift and strong military response. The United States promises to be generous in resettling Afghans in our own country, and I'm heartened by the pledges we've seen from other nations to do the same. We need to all do more, and the time to step up is now. We urge Afghanistan's neighbors and others in the region and beyond to give refuge, to be it temporary or permanent, to Afghans attempting to flee. And together we must do everything we can to help Afghans who wish to leave and seek refuge. I will close where I began. The Afghan people deserve to live in safety, security, and dignity. We in the international community stand ready to assist them. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. You have the floor, please.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Je vous remercie pour l'organisation de cette réunion à un moment tragique, historique pour l'Afghanistan. L'heure est grave en effet car une page se tourne et l'avenir de ce pays qui a tant souffert est plus incertain que jamais. Nous avons entendu le secrétaire général exprimer sa préoccupation et nous la partageons. Nos yeux sont tournés vers Kaboul et la paix et la sécurité de l'Afghanistan, mais aussi de la région sont en péril. J'aimerais en premier lieu rappeler notre ferme condamnation de la violence. reiterate our firm condemnation of violence and human rights violations and violations of IHL which are taking place at the moment in Afghanistan. All parties to the conflict must respect their commitments and in particular the protection of civilians. We would call for an immediate ceasefire and the respect of international law. In the middle of this violence, my heart goes out to all those who've built today's modern Afghanistan. They must be protected. Their protection, but more broadly the protection of civilians and in particular women and children must be an absolute priority. The perpetrators of abuse must be brought to justice. This council must carefully monitor the evolving situation. Civilians and in particular women and children must not be forgotten. Women must be protected, their rights must be respected. The democratic progress combating organised crime and in particular fighting drugs, the protection of cultural heritage, all of this progress which brought Afghanistan over the past 20 years into the international community must not be wiped out. The third priority is, of course, Afghan unity. Peace can only prevail if everyone participates in it. Finally, the security situation must not blot out the urgent humanitarian situation. The conflict has increased the number of displaced persons and is increasing the already immense needs of the entire population. Humanitarian assistance must be accessible to all. The access of medical and humanitarian staff to all people in need and also their protection must be guaranteed. In conclusion, sir, I would like to remind you that France stands shoulder to shoulder with the Afghan people and all its partners to make progress towards peace. The primary partner is UNAMA. Here I would like to commend the courage on the work of all of the teams of the mission under the auspices and coordination of Deborah Lyons, and I'd also like to commend the work of Jean Arnaud. The United Nations have a key role to play in Afghanistan, but the UN cannot work alone. The resolute commitment of the international community standing beside the Afghan people will also be decisive over the next few months and years. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing. Mr. President, what is happening now in Afghanistan is a tragedy. We have long believed that the only path to a sustainable peace in Afghanistan and regional stability lay in a negotiated political settlement. We have worked hard to breathe life into peace negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban, working closely with the US, our leading allies, and other regional powers. The Taliban pledged at Doha to engage in those talks in good faith. Their actions on the ground have betrayed that promise. Mr. President, the Taliban must immediately do three things. First, they need to cease all hostilities and military action to ensure the protection of civilians and to allow the safe and orderly departure of foreign nationals and others who wish to leave. Second, they must commit unequivocally not to harbour or give safe haven to terrorist groups which endanger other countries. And third, the Taliban must honour their promises to protect and uphold human rights, including those of women, girls and minorities. We have seen evidence of Taliban human rights abuses in areas where they have taken control, including persecution of minority groups, harsh restrictions on women, allegations of forced marriage and using civilians as human shields. If the Taliban continue to abuse basic human rights, they cannot expect to enjoy any legitimacy in the eyes of the Afghan people or the international community. Mr. President, given the fragile security situation, Afghanistan is now facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Lack of access has masked the true scale of the problem. Half the population were already in need of humanitarian assistance at the start of the year, and the situation is much worse now. The Taliban must respect international humanitarian law and permit humanitarian organizations to continue their work with unhindered, safe access to those in need. The United Kingdom has long been a leading provider of humanitarian aid to Afghans, both in Afghanistan and in the region. Over recent years, the UK has been proud to be one of the leading contributors to the Afghanistan Humanitarian Fund. We will continue to work with our partners in this Council, in the Human Rights Council, and most importantly, in the region, to deliver a more stable and inclusive Afghanistan for all its people. It is vital that the international community coordinate closely in the coming days and weeks to ensure that we speak with a single message in our engagement with Afghanistan. The UK will use its presidency of the G7 and membership of this Council to help forge such closer coordination and to address the humanitarian plight that the Afghan people now face. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya. You have the floor, please.
Good morning. Mr. President, I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the A3+1, namely Kenya, Tunisia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Niger. I thank the Secretary General for his briefing on the latest developments in Afghanistan. The A3+1 reiterates its support for the stabilization efforts deployed by the UN in the search for a durable solution to the Afghan crisis, which has been developing in warring ways in the past few days. Mr. President, this meeting comes on the heels of a similar meeting we held on the 6th of this month. If at that time we still harbored hope, as slim as that might have been, for the Taliban to heed our appeal and stop their attacks, today we're faced with a fait accompli, with the effective collapse of the Afghan government and a takeover by the insurgents. The A3+1 deplores the violence, human rights abuses, and the loss of life and the suffering endured by the civilian population who were forced to leave their areas because of the latest combat all over the country. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to the hostilities. We reiterate our principal rejection for any seizure of power by force and call for the establishment of an effective dialogue, convinced that the only viable solution to this conflict is a negotiated political settlement. We take note of the discussions between the Taliban and the different Afghan stakeholders. We hope that these negotiations will result in an interim transitional government that would be inclusive and take into account other political voices within the country. We also urge the international community and all regional powers that have leverage on the warring parties to use that influence and advocate for a lasting ceasefire, which is a condition for true dialogue. Mr. President, while it is difficult to predict how the coming days, months, or years will unfold, in particular with regard to the political and security situations, one thing that remains for certain is that Afghanistan is on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe of which the first victims are women and children. The A3+1 would therefore like to highlight the importance of finding an urgent and sustainable solution to the already dire humanitarian crisis, which has been worsened by the recent fighting. The effects of the recent upsurge of violence, combined with those of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, have created a situation where more than a third of the population is experiencing food insecurity and thousands are internally displaced, the overwhelming majority being women and children. We call for the United Nations and the humanitarian agencies to step up their support to the displaced populations and honor the pledges made to the Afghan humanitarian plan. Mr. President, the Afghan people now, more than ever, need the support and solidarity of the international community and regional players to help them navigate this challenging time. Every effort must be made to mitigate the pains of the civil war and to assist them in their search for peace and a stable environment conducive to the pursuit of democratic governance as well as social and economic well-being. The A3+1 continue to welcome and fully support the good offices of the United Nations and all other diplomatic efforts by neighboring countries to reduce tension in order to reach a negotiated solution to the crisis. Furthermore, we emphasize that the search for peace must not be at the expense of Afghan human rights, particularly those of women, children, and Afghanistan's ethnic and religious minorities. While making peace requires settlement between combatants, we believe that the international community does not wish for peace processes to reward and legitimize the use of military interventions and association with terrorist organizations through political recognition. We recall how the Taliban came to be thrown out of power because of their support of al-Qaeda. Reports of the release of prisoners affiliated to ISIS and al-Qaeda by the Taliban are extremely disturbing. Such actions will embolden terrorist networks and motivate a resurgence of increased export of terrorism, particularly to countries in regions that have active conflict situations. In its statement of the 6th of August, the A3+1 recalled this Council's decision to split the al-Qaeda and Taliban sanction lists in response to efforts by the Afghan government to negotiate a peace process with the Taliban that would lead to national reconciliation in Afghanistan. The purpose of this decision was to provide a future lifeline for members of the Taliban that renounce violence and disassociate themselves from al-Qaeda. Therefore, the Council must not relent in its demand that the Taliban make sustained efforts to embrace peace, cease its links with al-Qaeda and ISIS, and engage in the peace process that will transform Afghanistan to a net exporter of peace. As we conclude, Mr. President, the A3+1 notes that the situation in Afghanistan is extremely volatile and unpredictable. Armed insurgent groups and terrorist groups across the world are watching closely in order to replicate the unraveling events. This Council must therefore carefully consider the decisions it makes, fully aware that building political tracks for entities using terrorism to achieve political ends will in the end be counterproductive. Finally, Kenya, Tunisia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Niger reaffirm their unwavering solidarity with the people of Afghanistan during these uncertain times and reaffirm our support for their vision for a peaceful and progressive country. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank the Secretary-General for his presence with us here today and for his very powerful words at the beginning of our meeting. Mr. President, we supported the convening of this urgent meeting today to discuss the unfolding tragic development in Afghanistan. Over the past weeks, we've witnessed, as we've heard in real time, the Taliban seizing control of Afghan cities by force, culminating in the loss of government control in Kabul. We've all seen the scenes of chaos at the airport. We cannot say that we were not warned of this possible outcome. In this room, we have heard many worrying alerts, not least in the courageous testimony of members of Afghan civil society. Sadly and tragically for so many, we failed to heed these warnings. Now we will have to address the consequences. Now, in the face of an unfolding crisis of tragic proportions, this Council will have to assume its responsibilities and act. Mr. President, this is a calamitous situation for all of the people of Afghanistan. As we have consistently done in this chamber, we condemn the appalling violence and the indiscriminate attacks perpetrated against civilians in Afghanistan. The violence and intimidation must end. It's clear that we have entered a new phase in Afghanistan. Peace will only be achieved through an agreed, inclusive and negotiated solution. Violence does not provide legitimacy, nor does it deliver durable peace. Respect for the rule of law and compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law, is imperative. We call now for the utmost restraint to protect lives and to ensure that the dire humanitarian needs be addressed. Given the urgency of the situation and the desperate plight facing the Afghan people, it is vital that we act to address the crisis facing Afghanistan. Lives are at imminent risk through worsening violence, displacement and food insecurity. The international community has a responsibility to respond, to act to protect civilians and to alleviate the suffering of the Afghan people. Safe and reliable humanitarian access must be guaranteed and protected. and the work of all relevant UN agencies and humanitarian partners be facilitated without exception. Mr. President, those who have worked for peace, human rights defenders who have endeavoured tirelessly to promote and protect the rights of their fellow citizens must not be abandoned now. I wish to address the women of Afghanistan directly. Women who have the most at stake as democratic government dissolves and an uncertain future awaits. Lest there be any doubt as to the gravity of the situation, I am speaking to the women at the airport with their children and families trying to find a way out, to the women hiding in their homes, to the women sleeping in the streets, to the women still fighting for peace and human rights, though it may well now risk their lives. Women of Afghanistan, we hear you, and we hear your pleas to the international community at this dark time. The fear, indignation, and sense of betrayal you feel is understood. It is righteous. I call on this Council to stand with the women of Afghanistan. Their rights and their future participation in Afghan society cannot be sacrificed. This is our shared responsibility at this table. It must be our shared priority also. All of us around the table can and should agree that as a non-negotiable principle in all discussions, the rights of women in Afghanistan must be protected. This is the future of Afghanistan. The Taliban have reportedly said that women have nothing to fear from them, yet we hear multiple and credible reports of summary executions, forced marriages, and of sexual and gender-based violence. Telling the international community what it wants to hear will fool no one. We will not turn a blind eye to the truth. We condemn, in the strongest terms, the deliberate targeting of women and girls by the Taliban. Girls must be free to attend school, women must be able to participate fully in society, and those who speak up for human rights must be free to do so. In focusing on the needs of women, of course, I want to also condemn reported reprisals, attacks, and summary executions on Afghan men. This also must stop. Mr. President, it is high time to learn from the past, or we will be doomed to see the worst of history repeating itself in Afghanistan. 2 decades of progress are disintegrating on our watch. The Afghan people have worked too hard, lost too much, to see their futures repeat the past of their mothers, their fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers, generations lost to conflict. Strong, enduring peace can only be built by inclusive and representative negotiation. Let us be clear here today, the future governance of Afghanistan can only have the support and endorsement of the international community if it guarantees the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women, includes minority groups and youth, upholds human rights and fundamental freedoms, and ensures adherence to the rule of law and accountability as set out in Council Resolution 2513. In our view, the Council needs to be prepared to consider further measures from the toolbox at its disposal as this crisis unfolds. Afghan Minister for Education Ranjina Hamidi spoke in recent hours of her fear, shared by many Afghan women, that she will be forced to pay the price for trying to make Afghanistan a better place, for being active in her society, simply realising her rights. Ireland calls for a clear message today from this Council. While much, including the political future of Afghanistan, is currently uncertain, what is clear is that the failure to fully respect and uphold the rights of all the people of Afghanistan, and in particular the rights and safety of women and girls, cannot and will not be accepted. We owe this to the women of Afghanistan and to all the people of Afghanistan who have kept faith with the promises of the international community for a brighter future. Our obligation is to act in solidarity with them all now in this time of crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico. You have the floor, please.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. México apoya la convocatoria a esta reunión
of
de
this
emergencia.
meeting, this emergency
Agradezco
meeting.
al secretario general por su
I
informe
thank the
sobre
Secretary
los
General for his
acontecimientos más
report on the
recientes
most
en
recent events in
Quisiera
Afghanistan.
agradecer igualmente a
I
las
also wish to thank the
delegaciones que están aquí
delegations
presentes y agradezco
present
la
here
presencia
today,
también la reconocemos
as
del
well
representante
as acknowledging
permanente
the
de
presence
Afganistán.
of the permanent
En el transcurso de
representative
las
of
últimas
Afghanistan.
semanas y en especial
During
durante
recent
este último
weeks,
fin de semana,
particularly
el
this
conflicto en
last
Afganistán
weekend,
ha entrado
the
en una
conflict
fase
in
más
Afghanistan
destructiva
has
y
entered
más
a more
mortífera.
destructive, deadly
El
phase.
avance del Talibán sobre los
The
principales
advance of the
centros urbanos y
Taliban
ahora
on the
Kabul
main
cambió
urban centers
drásticamente la
and now
dinámica
on
de poder
Kabul
y ha tenido un
drastically
impacto
changed the dynamics of
humanitario
power, and it
extremadamente
has had an
preocupante.
extremely concerning humanitarian
La
impact.
ofensiva militar deja
The
claro
military
que sigue
offensive
sin
makes it
negociarse un
clear
cese al fuego
that a
y que las
ceasefire has not
cifras de
yet been
víctimas por el
negotiated,
conflicto
and the
son
figures of
las más altas
victims
registradas.
of the conflict are the highest
México
recorded.
rechaza la vía de la
Mexico
fuerza y de la
rejects the use of
violencia
force
y
and of
subraya
violence.
enfáticamente que debe
We stress
respetarse el
emphatically
marco
that
institucional
the
del país
institutional
y
framework of the
buscarse
country
un
must be
proceso de
respected.
reconciliación nacional.
A process of
El
national
futuro de
reconciliation
Afganistán debe
must be
ser
sought.
decidido
Afghanistan's
democráticamente
future
por
must be
todas y por todos
democratically
los
decided
afganos.
upon by all
Mi país
Afghans.
igualmente deplora de manera
Mexico
inequívoca
also
los ataques
unequivocally
deliberados contra la
deplores
población
the
civil.
deliberate attacks on the civilian population.
Los reportes de ejecuciones
The reports
sumarias
of summary
y ataques
executions,
deliberados contra
deliberate
mujeres,
attacks on women,
apaleamientos, restricciones y
beatings,
censura de medios de
restrictions, and the
comunicación
censure
son
of
señal de
means of
alarma para la
communication
comunidad
are all
internacional.
alarm signs for the international community.
El precio más alto del atrincheramiento
The
político y
highest
militar
price
en
of the
Afganistán
political and
lo
military
continúan
entrenchment in
pagando
Afghanistan
los
is
más
being paid
vulnerables.
for by the most vulnerable.
La catastrófica trayectoria de
The
violencia
catastrophic
afecta a
trajectory
una
of violence
población que se
affects a
encuentra en
population
condiciones cada
which
vez
finds
más
itself in
precarias y
increasingly
con muy pocas
precarious
opciones,
conditions, with
especialmente
very
para
few
mujeres y
options,
niñas.
particularly for women and girls.
Personal humanitario, médicos,
Humanitarian
traductores
personnel,
y otros
doctors,
prestadores de servicios
interpreters, and
internacionales
other international
también se
service
encuentran en
providers
especial
are
vulnerabilidad en
also
estos momentos.
especially vulnerable at
Y
this
síntoma
moment.
de ello es la ola
A sign of
masiva
this
de
is the massive
desplazamientos que
wave
observamos
of
y la
displacements we have
desesperación de
noted
los civiles
and
por
the
huir del
despair,
país.
the desperate efforts of civilians to flee the country.
Señor presidente, la campaña
Mr.
militar
President,
ha
the
resultado en un
military
cambio
campaign
drástico de
has led
control
to a
sobre el
drastic change of
territorio y
control
de los medios
over the
materiales.
territory and material
Mi
resources.
país, México, llama urgentemente a que
My
la
country,
comunidad
Mexico, urgently
internacional
calls for the
evalúe muy
international
seriamente las
community to
transferencias
seriously
de
evaluate the
armas
transfers
que
of
podrían ser
weapons,
desviadas o
which
acabar
might be
en manos
diverted or
equivocadas.
end up in the wrong hands.
Mientras exista la
As long
proliferación de
as the
armamento,
proliferation
el
of
Talibán y
weaponry
otros
goes
grupos
on, the
habrá
Taliban
sustento
and
para
other
consolidar
groups
sus objetivos
will
por la
have the
vía de la
means
fuerza.
to reach
Por ello,
their
es que
ends
urgimos a que
through
no se
force.
aprueben transferencias
This is why we
irresponsables,
urge that
ya que se
irresponsible
ejerzan los máximos
transfers
estándares
not be approved,
internacionales
and that the
para
highest
contener el
international
impacto
standards be
catastrófico
applied
de la
to
situación por la que
contain the
atraviesa
catastrophic
Afganistán.
impact of the situation
Pese a
Afghanistan
los
is going
acuerdos
through.
firmados y la
Despite
existencia
the
de un
agreements
robusto marco
signed
de derecho
and the
internacional
existence of a
sobre combate al
robust
terrorismo,
framework of
nos
international
preocupa
law
también
fighting
que se abra
terrorism,
la
we are
puerta
also
a que
concerned
Afganistán
that the
sea,
door is
una vez
open
más,
for Afghanistan
refugio
to
seguro
once
para
again
grupos terroristas.
become a safe haven for terrorists.
Cualquier escenario para el futuro de
Any
Afganistán
scenario for
debe
Afghanistan's
asegurar que
future
esto no
must
suceda.
ensure that this does not happen.
Señor presidente, la comunidad
Mr. President,
internacional
the
y en
international
especial el
community,
Consejo de Seguridad,
particularly
debe
the
presentar
Security
un frente
Council,
común
must
para dejar en
present
claro que el presente curso de
a common
acción
front
resulta inaceptable
to
y que se tienen que
show
respetar
that the
los
use
compromisos
of
acordados
force is
y
unacceptable
privilegiar la
and
vía
that
del
the
diálogo
agreed
y de la
commitments must be
negociación política.
respected and that dialogue and political
Adicionalmente,
negotiation
solicitamos a
are
aquellos que
given
mantienen
prime
interlocución
place.
directa con el Talibán
We also call
a que
on those who
expresen
have
su más
direct
sonora
contacts
condena a los
with
ataques
the
contra
Taliban
civiles, en
to
particular
roundly
mujeres,
condemn
niños
attacks
y
on civilians,
minorías, y
particularly
llamar
women,
urgentemente
girls, and
a retomar
minorities,
las
and
negociaciones de una forma
we
constructiva.
call for
Muchas gracias.
a resumption of constructive negotiations as quickly as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, please.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
We would like to thank the UN Secretary General for his thoughts and views on the situation in Afghanistan. We would also like to thank the Permanent Representative of Afghanistan, Ambassador Ghulam Isakai. We are closely following the fast-changing situation in Afghanistan. As soon as the withdrawal of foreign forces was announced, we all heard worrying reports about an uptick in violence and the number of victims. Furthermore, as we've seen, major Afghan cities fell without much resistance. Since the last discussion in the Council, just 10 days have passed. However, the situation in the country over that time has changed beyond recognition. Today, all of our eyes are on Kabul, which yesterday was quickly abandoned by the country's leader, ordinary Afghans, and also a part of the diplomatic corps. It is clear that such a sharp turnabout took everyone by surprise. This involved those who very recently made public pronouncements about the degree of military preparedness of the Afghan law enforcement structures who were prepared and trained over the past 20 years. Broadly, we are continuing to closely monitor the situation in the country. Currently, we believe that there is no point in panicking. The main point is that a widespread bloodbath among civilians has been avoided. We urge all Afghan parties to refrain from hostilities and to foster a settlement peacefully. We believe that the main power players, or the international community rather, must help Afghanistan. They must pool their efforts, and this is to assist Afghanistan achieve national reconciliation. The Troika, Russia, China, and Pakistan, the expanded Troika, has been actively engaged in this. We believe that an important role could be played by Iran as well here. As regards our future official steps regarding the Taliban, we will interact with them irrespective of the evolving situation and their specific actions. According to our reports, the Taliban have already sought to bring public order and have also confirmed security guarantees for civilians and for the foreign diplomatic mission staff. We trust that in the current circumstances, the security of diplomatic staff and the UN presence in Afghanistan will be ensured and their institutions will enjoy immunity. In these circumstances, the Russian embassy in Kabul is continuing to operate normally. Mr. President, we are still concerned by the ongoing presence of terrorist threats in Afghanistan, including ISIL, Khorasan. Their terrorist activity is likely to spill across Afghanistan's borders and thus will threaten the security of neighboring countries in Central Asia. Terrorism is inextricably linked to the drugs problem. The deteriorating situation in Afghanistan over recent months has led to a sharp worsening humanitarian situation. Of concern are the numerous reports about the number of IDPs and the flows of refugees across the country's border. It creates an additional burden for neighboring states, including Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and Pakistan, not to mention the risk of fighters infiltrating the region inter alia by pretending to be refugees. We are in regular contact with all 5 Central Asian countries, both bilaterally and through regional organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Mr. President, we still want to see a swift, peaceful settlement in Afghanistan and a subsequent stabilization of the country and its post-conflict recovery. We're convinced that an end to the years-long bloody war and having national reconciliation would benefit all, the people of Afghanistan, its regional neighbors, and the world as a whole. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam. You have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you, President. And I thank the Secretary General for your presence and for your briefings. I also welcome the presence of representative of Afghanistan to our briefing today. Mr. President, we have followed the situation in Afghanistan, especially in the recent days, with deep concerns. This situation may affect badly the security and stability of not only Afghanistan, but also the region, especially neighboring countries. We are particularly concerned about the high number of civilian casualties reported over the past few weeks. In this regard, I wish to highlight the following. First, the utmost priority now is to protect civilians. All parties must respect their obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law, ensure the protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, such as women and children. Indispensable services to civilian population must be ensured. The safety and security of UN personnel, humanitarian workers, foreign citizens, international organizations, diplomatic mission and personnel must be guaranteed. Second, we join others in calling for an end to violence, restoration of security and civil order. We call on all parties in Afghanistan to engage in dialogue, resolve their differences, and promote national reconciliation, respecting aspiration of Afghan people for a long-term peace, stability, and development of the country. Third, urgent efforts are needed to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe of the country. Essential services for civilian population must not be disrupted, including those to address food insecurity and COVID-19 pandemic. Immediate, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured to reach the Afghan people in need. We also call on the UN, regional and international partners to redouble their effort to achieve the above-mentioned priorities, with special urgent attention to the protection and the assistance to civilian population in this difficult time. Last but not least, we would like to commend the effort of UNAMA and stress the importance of ensuring the security and safety of the mission. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China. You have the floor, please.
Welcome, Secretary General, to the meeting today, and I thank him for the briefing. I've listened to the statement by the representative of Afghanistan. The situation in Afghanistan has undergone major changes. We respect the will and choices of Afghan people. The war in Afghanistan has lasted for more than 40 years. Stopping the war and achieving peace is not only the unanimous aspiration of more than 30 million Afghan people, it is also the common expectation of the international community and the regional countries. The pressing task at the moment is to restore peace, stability, and order as soon as possible, so as to avoid unnecessary casualties and large-scale refugees to the utmost extent possible. The rights and interests of diplomatic missions and personnel in Afghanistan are inviolable. The safety, security, and interests of foreign nationals in Afghanistan must be respected and guaranteed. All parties in Afghanistan have the responsibility to protect people's lives and property. They should provide assurance for the safe residence and orderly evacuation of foreign citizens. President, China has always maintained that a political solution is the only way out for Afghanistan. At present, Afghanistan's national prospects are at a historic crossroads. China takes note of what was said by the Afghan Taliban yesterday, that war in Afghanistan had ended and that it would negotiate to establish an open, inclusive Islamic government, and it would take responsible actions to ensure the safety of Afghan citizens and foreign missions in the country. China expects that these commitments will be fulfilled so as to ensure a smooth transition of the situation, curb all kinds of terrorism and criminal acts, keep the Afghan people away from wars and chaos, and build their beautiful homeland. We hope that Taliban in Afghanistan will unite with all parties and ethnic groups in Afghanistan to establish a broad and inclusive political structure that suits its national conditions in order to lay the foundation to achieve lasting peace in the country. In the last 20 years, terrorist organizations such as Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and ATM have gathered and developed and developing Afghanistan, posing a serious threat to international and regional peace and security. Afghanistan must never again become a haven for terrorists. This is the bottom line that must be held firmly for any future political solution in Afghanistan. We hope that the Taliban in Afghanistan will earnestly deliver on their commitments and make a clean break with the terrorist organizations. All countries should fulfill their obligations in accordance with international law and Security Council resolutions, work with each other in combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and take resolute actions to prevent terrorist organizations such as Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and ETM from taking advantage of this chaos. As we speak, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is very dire. Humanitarian assistance and epidemic prevention and control are under tremendous pressure. The international community should scale up humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan and its neighbors that have received a large number of displaced persons from Afghanistan to help alleviate the regional humanitarian crisis. The relevant parties should ensure that the work of international humanitarian relief agencies can continue unhindered. The international community should also continue to help Afghanistan and its neighbors to control the pandemic as soon as possible. President, the chaos currently in Afghanistan is directly related to the hasty withdrawal of foreign troops. Relevant countries should earnestly deliver the commitment to support peace, reconciliation, and reconstruction in Afghanistan, and play a constructive role on the issue of Afghanistan. On the basis of respecting the leadership of Afghanistan and relevant efforts of the neighboring countries in the political, security, development, humanitarian, and anti-narcotics fields, constructive assistance to Afghanistan should be provided on a continuing basis. A few council members said in their statement that they wish to see that greater roles played by Afghan's neighbors and regional countries. We learned that some regional countries and Afghan's neighbors had made requests to participate in today's meeting. It is regrettable that their requests were not granted. For a long time, UNAMA mission has played an important role in supporting the peaceful reconstruction of Afghanistan. Given the current situation on the ground that has undergone major changes, we hope that the Secretary General will make proper arrangements to ensure the safety of personnel of the mission. We also look forward to the Secretary General presenting practical and actionable views and recommendations to the Security Council as soon as possible on the future UN presence in Afghanistan. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of India. Allow me at the outset to warmly welcome the Secretary General and his very important remarks. I also welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations. The Council is meeting for the second time in a period of 10 days to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. In this short period of time, we have witnessed dramatic changes in the situation. We have also seen very unfortunate scenes at the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. There is widespread panic among the people. Women and children are in distress. Incidents of firing have been reported from the city, including at the airport. While the security situation remains precarious, a grave humanitarian crisis is unfolding. We have heard urgent appeals from all quarters, including from the Secretary General. It is time for the international community, in particular this Council, to act and ensure an immediate cessation of violence and contain any possible crisis and mitigate its consequences. As a neighbor of Afghanistan, as a friend of its people, the current situation prevailing in the country is of great concern to us in India. Afghan men, women, and children are living under a constant state of fear. They are uncertain about their future. Everyone is concerned about the increasing violations of the fundamental rights of the Afghan citizens. Afghans are worried about whether their right to live with dignity would be respected. There are many unanswered questions. We hope that the situation stabilizes soon and the parties concerned address the humanitarian and security issues. We also hope that there is an inclusive dispensation which represents all sections of Afghan society, voices of Afghan women, aspirations of Afghan children, and the rights of minorities must be respected. A broader representation would help the arrangement gain more acceptability and legitimacy. The current situation in Afghanistan has numerous challenges. However, there are a few opportunities. If there is a zero tolerance for terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and it is ensured that the territory of Afghanistan is not used by terrorist groups to threaten or attack any other country, then Afghanistan's neighbors and the region would feel safer. The Secretary General has underlined this unequivocally just now. Afghanistan has already seen enough bloodshed in the past. It is time for the international community to come together unitedly, rising above any partisan interests, to support the people of Afghanistan in their desire for peace, stability, and security in the country, and to enable all Afghans, including women, children, and minorities, to live in peace and dignity. India has contributed significantly in recent years to the development of the country. In this context, Indian development projects has been undertaken in critical areas of power, water, road, healthcare, education, agriculture, and capacity building. India's emphasis has been on the welfare and the well-being of the people of Afghanistan. Before the current crisis unfolded, India had ongoing development projects in every one of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan. As underscored by Council members, we need to continue to support the robust work of UNAMA and ensure their safety. We call upon the parties concerned to maintain law and order, ensure the safety and security of all concerned, including UN, diplomatic, and consular personnel, and observe human rights and international humanitarian law in all circumstances in Afghanistan. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I'll now adjourn the meeting so that the Council can continue its discussion on the subject in closed consultations. I kindly ask all observers to exit the chamber upon the adjournment of this meeting. The meeting is adjourned.
C-SPAN is your unfiltered view of government. We're funded by these television companies and more, including Charter Communications.
Broadband is a force for empowerment. That's why Charter has invested billions, building infrastructure, upgrading technology, empowering opportunity in communities big and small. Charter is connecting us.
Charter Communications supports C-SPAN as a public service, along with these other television providers, giving you a front row seat to democracy.
On this Monday morning, hearing from you, asking what did the war in Afghanistan mean? A morning perhaps for headlines, banner headlines across all the major newspapers this morning. From the New York Times, this is how they put it: Taliban capture Kabul, stunning U.S. as a 20-year effort unravels in days. To the front page this morning of the Washington Times, U.S. surrenders Kabul is their headline and scrambles to evacuate. To the front page this morning of the Wall Street Journal, Taliban seize power as U.S. retreats. And one more from the front page of the Washington Post this morning. The subheadline there: Pentagon rushes additional troops to Capitol to aid the chaotic effort to evacuate U.S. personnel and their allies. Just some of the front page headlines this morning as we ask you to call in. As you're calling in this morning, here's one more lead. This from Punchbowl News this morning. This is how they lead their morning newspaper with a picture at the top, one of those many pictures. This from the Getty image of U.S. helicopters yesterday over Kabul. And this is how they write their lead this morning. The United States lost more than 2,400 troops in Afghanistan, with another 3,400 plus contractors killed as well. More than 20,000 Americans were injured. Tens of thousands of Afghans were killed and wounded. The U.S. government spent more than $1 trillion during nearly 2 decades of conflict. And what do we have to show for it? Our question for you: what did the war in Afghanistan mean? Phone numbers again: Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002, and that special line do especially want to hear throughout this morning from veterans of the war in Afghanistan. 202-748-8003 is that number. Daniel's up first, though, here in Washington, D.C., an independent. Daniel, good morning to you.
Thank you for including the tens of thousands of Afghanis who've been killed, millions of refugees due to this failed war. Let's all remember that the Taliban was basically started when Reagan was giving military assistance to the Mujahideen to move the Soviet Union's much more progressive government out of Afghanistan. And he was giving military aid in Angola to horrible murderers, in Nicaragua to the Contras. And it is truly our interventionist policy that's obviously coming home to roost. America is the merchants of death around the world. I'm curious to where the Taliban get its weaponry. But sending all these bombs and billions of military equipment to the Saudis, the intervention that we're obviously planning in Iran and against Venezuela, the United States needs to stop its aggression and its intervention. Now we had our own election interfered with. Now we know what it's like. But when we go to these countries, the candidates are killed. The media is taken over. Sabotaging elections is as American as apple pie. And look what it's doing to the Afghanis. Let's not forget all these casualties, all the collateral damage, the drones that have killed people at their weddings. The United States has got to stop being an aggressive, militaristic force. The United States defense budget is the most obscene thing in the entire world.
That's Daniel here in D.C. Cy is next. Akron, Ohio, independent. Cy, what did these past 20 years mean?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, John. I want to say what four groups have in common in regards to Afghanistan. President Cossiga of Italy, Andreas von Bülow, a member of the German cabinet, members of the Japanese Diet, and French intelligence. And they all say that 9/11 was an inside job and that the purpose was to give the U.S. an excuse to invade Afghanistan. Because the people...
do you still believe that it was an inside job?
Do I?
Do you?
Yes. There used to be thousands of websites at 9/11truth.org, Scholars for 9/11 Truth, Engineers for 9/11 Truth, etc. And Lieutenant General Stubblebine.
We'll hold off on the 9/11 conspiracy theories this morning as we talk about the 20-year effort, military effort in Afghanistan. Yesterday, the flag comes down on the U.S. Embassy, Kabul, taken by the Taliban. And Arthur is in Baltimore City, Maryland, a Democrat watching it all. Arthur, what are you seeing?
Yes, I don't think I'm that surprised that the capital failed, or that Afghan soldiers would not defend their own country. You know, we put 20 years of our blood, sweat, tears, our treasure into defending the Afghanis, and they for 20 years. You mean to tell me they can't do it for 1 month? They didn't even, sounds like they didn't even lift a rifle, didn't do anything to defend their own country. And I'm kind of torn as to the move that Biden made. I think I kind of agree with it, but I think that the strategy and the tactics of getting out was never clearly defined or put into to effect. You know, so where this is going is anybody's guess. But I want to thank you for allowing me to express my comments.
Kathleen in Chicago, Democrat. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Kathleen.
Okay, I agree with President Biden. It's time for our men and women to come home. They've been over there for 20 years. People just sitting up here commenting about it's too soon to come from Afghanistan. You suit up and go over there. Some of these vets have did 5 and 6 deployments over there. They need to come home and be with their families. And before you hang up on me, the same thing that America is going over there fighting for the Afghanistan, they need to be fighting for it over here. They're trying to make it here in America where the black and the brown can't vote, overturning our votes. They don't want the women to have a right to choose what they do with their bodies. United States is in a bad situation, and it looks good. You know, when I saw those guys going into the palace, I thought about January the 6th. The same thing that they did yesterday to that palace, Donald Trump had his people do in the United States January 6th. So the United States need to mind their business, come home, and let these guys rest. And these same soldiers that's over there fighting in another country to help those people, when they come back, their mamas and daddies and some of them won't even be able to vote.
That's Kathleen in Chicago this morning. Here's another one of those headlines from this morning's papers from the New York Times this morning. In Afghanistan, the images that Biden had wanted to avoid, that picture that the viewer was just talking about, Taliban fighters taking control of the Afghan presidential palace in Kabul yesterday after Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, fled the country. There's the AP photo. It was yesterday as these events were going down in Afghanistan and as the situation continued to deteriorate. It was yesterday morning that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was on CNN's State of the Union, was asked about the U.S. effort in Afghanistan over the past 20 years and the decision to leave. This is what he said.
We were in Afghanistan for one overriding purpose, to deal with the folks who attacked us on 9/11. That's why we went there 20 years ago. And over those 20 years, we brought bin Laden to justice. We vastly diminished the threat posed by al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to the United States, to the point where it's not capable of conducting such an attack again from Afghanistan. We're going to keep in place in the region the capacity to see if any reemergence of a terrorist threat and to be able to deal with it. And on the terms that we went into Afghanistan in the first place, we've succeeded in achieving our objectives. When the president came to office, he had a decision to make. The previous administration negotiated an agreement with the Taliban that said that our forces, our remaining forces, only about 2,500, would be out of the country on May 1st. And the idea that the status quo could have been maintained by keeping our forces there, I think is simply wrong. The fact of the matter is, had the president decided to keep forces in Afghanistan beyond May 1st, attacks would have resumed on our forces. The Taliban had not been attacking our forces or NATO during the period from which the agreement was reached to May 1st. The offensive you're seeing across the country now to take these provincial capitals would have commenced, and we would have been back at war with the Taliban. And I'd probably be on this program today explaining why we were sending tens of thousands of American forces back into Afghanistan and back to war, something the American people simply don't support. That is the reality. That's the context that we're dealing with.
Expecting more from the State Department today, a State Department briefing later this morning expected, and we're expected as well to hear from the president at some point, though not a specific time frame set for when the president will address the country. This is a tweet from the White House yesterday, though, concerning President Biden. This tweet showing him at the briefing rooms, the classified briefing room set up in Camp David. This morning, the president and vice president met with their national security team and senior officials to hear updates on the drawdown of our civilian personnel in Afghanistan, the evacuations, the special immigrant visa applications for Afghan allies, and the ongoing security situation. That picture from yesterday morning of the president there speaking to his advisors. Speaking to you this morning, asking you, what did the war in Afghanistan mean? And again, we have that special phone line for Afghan war veterans and their family members can call in too on that phone line. 202-748-8003 is that number. Youssef is next out of Virginia. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Go ahead.
I have several concerns. I don't know the intelligence of the U.S. government, how they didn't know. It struck very odd to me how they just didn't know that the Taliban can swoop down in there expeditiously and very, very fast just after the U.S. leaves. That's very puzzling to me. And also, the Chinese just came out 2 days ago saying that they would work with the Taliban if they took over the government. So the Chinese now are in there in a geopolitical way. Now they're going to work with the Taliban, as you see that they did with Iran and things like that. So this is coming to be out a very scary scenario working out in that area. And I'm very upset about that. Also, I'm also concerned about, as an African-American Muslim myself, I'm concerned about all of these immigrant Muslims coming over here and changing the whole landscape of the indigenous African-American Muslims that are majority of the population of Muslims in this country. I'm very concerned about that. I don't agree with bringing all these immigrant Muslims over here from Afghanistan.
Changing it how, Youssef? What concerns you?
I'm concerned of their inability to adapt and assimilate into the American cultural system. I'm concerned about that because majority of Muslims in this country right now are African-American Muslims, half of which are in prison. And we've been here since slavery, and they're coming in the country, taking over the whole landscape and usurping the power from the African-American Muslims. And I'm very concerned about this. America needs to invest in us, the African-American Muslims, as they invest in the Afghanistan Muslims. Reform us in the prison system, assist us, and bring us on our way. And hopefully we can work with the State Department. We can work with Foreign Affairs. And they need to invest in us like they did the Afghanis. Thank you.
That's Youssef out of Virginia. Scott, Baltimore City, Maryland, Independent. You're next.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'll keep it brief because I got to run. When al-Sisi initiated a coup in Egypt because of the Muslim Brotherhood had won elections, one of his justifications was that these men were perverting Islam and that Islam needed a new narrative. Those were his exact words. Islam needs a new narrative. Where I think we failed in 20 years is to win their hearts and minds, if you will, by presenting Islam in such a light that they were able to see the Taliban the way we Americans see the Klan or the American neo-Nazi party. We didn't do that. We did everything else, but we didn't help them see how the Taliban was such an anathema to their own faith. I think that's where we failed. We had 20 years to do that, and nobody was willing to do it. So,
and Scott, was it a failure of picking the right voices and people to work with in Afghanistan to do what you're saying?
I think it was to a degree. I also think, honestly, that this key, if you will, was presented comprehensively in detail, but it scared some people in-house. Remember, there's bad people on both sides, finger quotes, and I think it scared some people. The thought that we would try and do something like that and possibly actually win, if you will, their hearts and minds, scared people. So knowing what was required, I think those who had the authority to do so said, well, let's not do that. Let's do all of these other things, but we're not climbing into Islam and trying to establish a new narrative. That's just scary.
That's Scott out of Baltimore City, Maryland this morning. In terms of the main voice that we were working with in Afghanistan has now fled the country. Ashraf Ghani, president forced out of power by insurgents. The headline there from the Washington Post this morning. India Today reporting, and a couple other sites reporting as well, that Ashraf Ghani is likely to be eventually headed to the United States as plenty of stories trying to determine where exactly he went after fleeing the country yesterday. Devin is next out of Philadelphia. Independent, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I see the news article, news about how the president of Afghanistan is fleeing. I saw the president of Haiti, he got killed, and then the acting or the wife was fled here. My thing is this: these countries are independent countries. They have their own military, their own intelligence. We spent $715 billion of taxpayers' money in military, and we got to rebuild everybody's nation? No. How about we rebuild our own? How about we give some of that money back to us? I'm not saying we don't help people, because we definitely should do that and continue. But at what point do we say $700 billion? That's and then the Afghan forces have, as they say, fled, and 1 minute, about 30 days or so ago, everything was okay, everything was calm, everything, and then overnight they've taken over everything. Now something doesn't make sense. Something's off here.
Devin, on the numbers that you quote, $1 trillion is the number that's been put out there for total U.S. spending in Afghanistan, including some $83 billion on training Afghan forces. That story from Tara Kopp of Defense One, and we're going to be talking to her a little bit later in about 45 minutes this morning. But on that spending and $1 trillion, what did it eventually buy us?
Well, I just think it's failed, because let's face it, we should ask an additional question. What would America look like if we'd invested $1 trillion directly into the Americans? You could have ended homelessness. You could have addressed food insecurity.
Devin out of Philadelphia this morning. That special line for veterans of the war in Afghanistan. Adam's on that line out of New York City. Adam, thanks for calling in. When were you in Afghanistan?
Hi, yeah, I was a civilian in Afghanistan during the civilian surge from 2009 to 2011. I'm actually sitting outside the 9/11 memorial right now and thinking about kind of why we went in. And, we tried to eliminate al-Qaeda, I guess, but mostly I'm thinking of the 20 years that a lot of Afghans got to see a different future, and that's all being taken away right now. And I'm really struggling today. It's really tough, because I would say we could piss and moan, we can sturm and drang about what happened and why we messed up, but everyone needs to contact HIAS, the Hebrew Refugee Society, and Lutheran Refugee Resettlement, LARS, and get as many people out as we can, because there's going to be a lot of people that get killed.
Adam, have you been in touch over the years since you left with some of the people that you knew or you worked with?
It's tough. I've been out of touch with a lot of them. Some of them are still Facebook friends. If you are Facebook friends with an Afghan, make sure it's secret. They will check that. I know I have a friend who works at State Department, who was up all night probably trying to get people out. I know people from NGOs, democracy promotion organizations, and they had meetings yesterday morning of like, what the hell? Oh my God, like it's happening now. Like there's no time. We need to get them out now. It was sudden, and I mean you could see the scenes from the airport. It was a mess.
Were you in Kabul when you were there in 2009?
I was in Kabul. I lived in Kabul. I was in a district called Shafsharak, right across the street from Blackwater. Actually, it was kind of funny, but yeah, that's where I was.
What did you think when you saw those pictures yesterday of Taliban soldiers driving through town, slowly driving on vehicles through town, and then the press briefing they held yesterday at the presidential palace?
I was gutted. I had to leave the house. I took myself out to a bar, and I just wanted to get blackout drunk. It's heartbreaking, and I'm fine. We're all fine in America. We'll be okay. But the people left there, it's going to be hell for so many women, so many girls. So that's what I think.
Adam, do you think you'll ever get back to Afghanistan someday? Do you want to go back?
I mean, I'd love to go back. I thought, when I was there and I left in 2011, I'm like, you know what, maybe in 20 years I'll go back, and, it's kind of like the 70s again, where it's a bunch of hippies hanging out, in the mountains. I don't know now. I have no idea. The world takes its turns, and you don't know what's going to happen. So,
were you
we'll see what happens.
You're at the 9/11 memorial. Were you in New York on 9/11?
I wasn't. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I was in Omaha, so yeah, I was in high school when it happened. So,
what do you think? Describe the scene where you are at the memorial this morning. Do you think it's more crowded than usual?
Nope, it's really quiet. It's currently chained off. I guess they don't open till like maybe 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. or something. But you know, it's quiet. You can hear the water flowing. You know, it was a tragedy on 9/11 and it's a tragedy in Kabul today. So I guess we'll see what happens with everything.
Adam, thanks for the call from where you are in New York City. Talking to viewers around the country this morning, and going to spend all 3 hours doing it this morning, asking you, what did the war in Afghanistan mean, having this conversation a day after Kabul falls, the U.S. flag pulled down from the U.S. Embassy, and the scramble to evacuate U.S. personnel, Afghan allies continues today. Here's our phone lines to call in and talk about it. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002, and that special line for veterans of the war in Afghanistan and their family members, or as our last caller, if you have served in Afghanistan in some capacity over the past 20 years, 202-748-8003. As you call in, we'll continue to update you with news as it happens, but also the reaction yesterday to the collapse of the security system, scene in Kabul. This from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell yesterday, the Republican of Kentucky, saying everyone saw this coming except the president, who publicly and confidently dismissed these threats just a few weeks ago. The strategic, humanitarian, and moral consequences of this self-inflicted wound will hurt our country and distract from other challenges for years to come. A proud superpower has been reduced to hoping that the Taliban will not interfere with our efforts to flee Afghanistan. God knows what fate awaits vulnerable Afghans who cannot make it to Kabul to board one of the final flights out. Terrorists and major competitors like China are watching the embarrassment of a superpower laid low. That from Mitch McConnell. Here's a few more statements. The tweet from Speaker Nancy Pelosi yesterday. Speaker Pelosi saying that the president is to be commended for the clarity of purpose of his statement on Afghanistan over the weekend, his actions. The Taliban must know that the world is watching its actions. We are concerned about the reports regarding Taliban's brutal treatment of all Afghans, especially women and girls. And this as well from Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, saying the situation in Afghanistan is tragic for everyone who has worked tirelessly over 20 years to root out terrorism and create stability in the country. There's plenty to blame all the way around, but for now our focus must be on doing absolutely everything possible to save lives. And this as well from Ruben Gallego, the congressman, saying that this is not the case. It's sad the American public stopped caring about Afghanistan years ago. National security veterans and media and politicos were just talking to each other for years while isolating the general public on the topic of Afghanistan. This from Senator Jim Inhofe, saying what's happening in Afghanistan is heartbreaking. The president owns this mess and the blood is on his hands. He needs to admit that he made a strategic mistake leading to a tragic consequence for U.S. national security and for the Afghan people. Some of the tweets, one last one from Lindsey Graham, the Republican from South Carolina, saying the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban is a sad and dangerous event for U.S. national security interests and the world at large. Jihadists all over the world are celebrating this event. Again, just some of the tweets and comments from members of Congress, and we'll have plenty of them for you, plenty of reaction yesterday. But for now, it's your comments, leaving you the phone lines this morning for all 3 hours of the Washington Journal to get your thoughts on the war in Afghanistan. What did it mean? This is Ronnie in Irving, Texas, a Democrat. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. First and foremost, my heart goes out to Adam and to all the others who served over there, the ones that made it home and the ones that didn't. The caller, a few callers back, raised one of my concerns. How could our intelligence not have foreseen this coming, number one? Number two, as far as Mitch McConnell's statement, he is an embarrassment unto America, unto himself, so he needs to keep his mouth shut. I can blame Trump and Biden both. Trump was held bent and determined to pull most of our soldiers out of there, which he did. And I blame Biden because Biden should have known better than to he should have left some over there anyway, till things were stabilized just a little bit better. I feel like nothing was accomplished. We went over there to get rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We left. Now they're back strongholds. So basically, I feel like nothing was really accomplished, just a bunch of U.S. Lives lost and a bunch of money spent. Anyway, that's my comments. Thank you. Have a good day.
Oakdale, New York. David, Republican. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I have a little bit of the history of what's going on in the Middle East as well, but I don't believe that we should have pulled out. I don't think that a lot of the people in this country understand what Sharia law is. I think the people in Afghanistan are going to be in for a rude awakening, and the Taliban, if there was nothing in Afghanistan to take over, like poppy plants and all that, they wouldn't be there, but it's control. They have a lot of control of the whole country. They got backing with China. Biden never should have pulled out, and we shouldn't be pulling our troops out of South Korea, North Korea, or Germany. We're there for a big reason. And now that we left, we see exactly what happened. Same thing happened in Vietnam.
It's David in New York, and this was President Biden from just last month, about a month ago, defending his decision to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan.
So let me ask those who want us to stay. How many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons are you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome. The United States cannot afford to remain tethered to policies created in response to a world as it was 20 years ago. We need to meet the threats where they are today. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized beyond Afghanistan. So, we are repositioning our resources and adapting our counterterrorism posture to meet the threats where they are now, significantly higher in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But make no mistake, our military and intelligence leaders are confident they have the capabilities to protect the homeland and our interests from any resurgent terrorist challenge emerging or emanating from Afghanistan.
President Biden last month defending his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. This is the lead editorial in today's Wall Street Journal. Biden's Afghanistan surrender is how they put it, saying that Donald Trump's withdrawal deadline from Afghanistan was a mistake, but Mr. Biden could have maneuvered around that mistake. He knows this because his administration conducted an internal policy review that provided him with options. The Taliban had already violated its pledges under the Trump deal. Mr. Biden could have maintained the modest presence his military and foreign policy advisors suggested. He could have decided to withdraw, but done so based on conditions on the ground while preparing the Afghans with a plan for transition and air support. Instead, they write, he ordered a rapid and total withdrawal at the onset of the annual fighting season in time for the symbolic target date of 9/11. Most of the American press at the time hailed the decision as courageous. The result, a mere 4 months later, is the worst U.S. humanitarian humiliation since the fall of Saigon back in 1975. Dave, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Democrat. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Got a couple comments. I'm a 11-year Air Force vet. So my heart goes out to the guys who couldn't make it back, and my heart goes out to the guys that we lose to suicide every month. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was a botched operation. I think we didn't learn anything from Iraq when it comes to telegraphing our moves, like announcing these dates. I mean, that boggles my mind as a military person and as someone who just strategically thinks that we could have quietly got our people out, we could have quietly got our friends out. And that's the part that disturbs me the most, because what he was trying to avoid, the optic of Saigon, is exactly what happened, you know. But you mentioned a lot of the media keeping Afghanistan out of the minds of the public for much of these 20 years, and that's part of the problem too, because we forgot what war looks like. This is what Iraq looked like when we went in and toppled Saddam. You know, that famous picture of that statue coming down. You know, this is what war looks like. But when our media doesn't allow us to see that on a daily basis, or hides it from us for 20 years, we forgot what the reality is. You know, and yeah, we're going to lose a lot of friends who took care of us, who translated for us, who helped us navigate our lives in that environment. And that's sad. That's very sad. We should be doing everything we can to get those people out.
Dave, you mentioned optics and you mentioned Saigon as well. This picture printed in the Washington Post today, that famous picture, CIA employees helping Vietnamese evacuate from onto an American helicopter there in Saigon at the U.S., a half mile from the U.S. Embassy in 1975. That very famous picture. Talk about that optic and what you think will be the optic from yesterday.
Well, yeah, that's unfortunately for the next 20 years, that's going to be the optic that's burning into our minds. That's going to be the depiction of our 20 years there. That's what failure looks like. When you're getting out in the midst of total chaos, that means you failed. I mean, I would think a win is when you see an orderly exit from the situation. A win is when you have stories of resettlement, and not necessarily all of them in the U.S., but successful resettlements into neighboring allied countries. You know, that's what a success looks and feels like. You know, right now it's going to be, unfortunately, for years to come, it's going to be stories of turmoil and women being treated atrociously. You know, and then another part that gets me is how quickly they pulled this off. We know when we went into Iraq, a lot of Iraqis dropped their guns in front of us. So how many of those guys that we trained for 20 years simply gave up?
That's Dave in Pennsylvania. That optic you're seeing on your screen right now, a Getty image and one that is quite prevalent on news coverage yesterday of the U.S. helicopter over Kabul helping to evacuate U.S. personnel from the U.S. Embassy there. The headline to go along with that double truck picture in the New York Times today, U.S. is stunned as the Taliban overtakes Kabul. James in Maryland, Independent. Good morning, you're next.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, the thing is it's good that we got out of there. We've been there for a while. We forgot the goal and objective. The goal that they said was that the Taliban wouldn't give up bin Laden, and this was the reason that we went in there, and then we ended up staying in there. We didn't learn from the Russians. We boycotted the Olympics during the Jimmy Carter era. Everybody was mad. Why? Because the Russians had gone in there, and we supported a group, and the Mujahideen and other people, and then the Taliban rose up. But, you know, our issue wasn't to get rid of the Taliban. It was because they supposedly, you know, supported bin Laden. But the thing for me is I remember before 9/11, it was like 6 months, there was an article in the paper that said what Just Say No couldn't do. And the Taliban had finally made it forbidden for selling drugs, alcohol, and they poured it through the street. And so, they had got rid of the sale of heroin, opium, all of this drugs going on. Then after we went in, about 9 months later, you see an article, and they're doing more production of this heroin, and opium, and drugs going all over the world. So we know that drug continues. And I was like, okay, we got a war on drugs. We have no-fly zones, but they're not taking all of those drugs out on camels, to other countries. They're taking them and they're sending them all over the world, but we have a war on drugs. So this is the thing that you never see in the media. We're talking about optics. Let's see the optics of all of these places where we let that go on. We got no-fly zones and we're letting the drugs go on. So I'm glad that that's over. And another thing is this. That's the people's religion. We have to respect the people to making their choice. Like here in America, you have to respect the choice of your religion. This is how it is. And if somebody comes over and tries to change our religion, we would all have a problem. So we need to give the same respect that we expect. And
that's James in Maryland. James, you began by speaking about the original purpose to go in and finding, capturing, or killing Osama bin Laden. This is from May the 1st of 2011. Then President Obama announcing at the time the killing of Osama bin Laden in a U.S. military strike.
Over the last 10 years, thanks to the tireless and heroic work of our military and our counterterrorism professionals, we've made great strides in that effort. We've disrupted terrorist attacks and strengthened our homeland defense. In Afghanistan, we removed the Taliban government, which had given bin Laden and al-Qaeda safe haven and support. And around the globe, we worked with our friends and allies to capture or kill scores of al-Qaeda terrorists, including several who were a part of the 9/11 plot. Yet Osama bin Laden avoided capture and escaped across the Afghan border into Pakistan. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda continued to operate from along that border and operate through its affiliates across the world. And so shortly after taking office, I directed Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, to make the killing or capture of bin Laden the top priority of our war against al-Qaeda, even as we continued our broader efforts to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat his network. Then, last August, after years of painstaking work by our intelligence community, I was briefed on a possible lead to bin Laden. It was far from certain, and it took many months to run this thread to ground. I met repeatedly with my national security team as we developed more information about the possibility that we had located bin Laden hiding within a compound deep inside Pakistan. And finally, last week, I determined that we had enough intelligence to take action and authorized an operation to get Osama bin Laden and bring him to justice. Today, at my direction, the United States launched a targeted operation against that compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. A small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage and capability. No Americans were harmed. They took care to avoid civilian casualties. After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
Then President Obama back in May of 2011, taking your calls this morning in 2021, asking you about the 2 decades war in Afghanistan. What did it mean? Sandy, Columbus, Ohio, Democrat, good morning.
Good morning. I'm just calling to say I've listened to a couple other callers that other things that I may not understand, but what I don't understand is how the president and they fled so fast and didn't try, to me, to get their people in some type of safety. They could have done that. To my understanding, they have more troops, they have more ammunition, and we've been there several years training, and every time we pull out, they let the Taliban take over. I don't know whether the planning for us coming out and what they should do should be on the United States. And I do feel for those girls and the people there, but it seems like to me that they didn't try even to get them out of harm's way. You know, they just like it looks like they just ran, and they've been equipped again. So that's what I don't understand. Thank you for listening to me.
That's Sandy in Ohio. This is John in Clifton Park, New York. Independent. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for what you're doing. It's an important topic. Now, everybody's talking about 9/11, the intelligence community, and so on and so forth. They're forgetting why we initially went in. In my opinion, if we were not attacked on 9/11, we would not have been in Afghanistan. Our intelligence community at the time, according to what the 9/11 Commission reported, was they were aware of heightened activity at the time prior to the 9/11 attacks. That's neither here nor there. We could have avoided this war. Second of all, everybody's talking about al-Qaeda. They talk about, Obama just made reference to Osama bin Laden. Who are these people in al-Qaeda? Most of from my remembrance, most of the terrorists in 9/11 were Saudis. Why the hell were we attacking people or harboring these terrorists instead of the terrorist community itself? To me, that's not understandable. We could have avoided all these deaths of all of our own citizens, let alone all the Afghani people, if we had thought about that instead of having a knee-jerk reaction to what had occurred.
We played the clip of then President Obama announcing the killing of Osama bin Laden. Let me take you back 10 years before that, October of 2001, then President George W. Bush announcing the start of military action in Afghanistan. This is what he had to say from the White House.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain. Other close friends, including Canada, Australia, Germany, and France, have pledged forces as the operation unfolds. More than 40 countries in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and across Asia have granted air transit or landing rights. Many more have shared intelligence. We are supported by the collective will of the world. More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. Close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the al-Qaeda network, and return all foreign nationals, including American citizens unjustly detained in your country. None of these demands were met. And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Then President George W. Bush from October of 2001. Taking your phone calls this morning, asking you, 20 years later, what did the war in Afghanistan mean? Michael, Cleveland, Ohio, Republican. Go ahead.
I agree with that last gentleman wholeheartedly. There's one thing I have a suspicion of. When they talk about the guys laying down their guns, the Afghan soldiers, they did it in Iraq too, and probably Syria. I think it was all about money. We can pay people off over there. They're so damn poor, they don't have a dollar. I really believe that money was exchanged with a lot of these guys that took off and
Michael,
ran and left equipment.
What about the $1 trillion spent over the past 20 years by the United States, that money going into Afghanistan?
That's it. Listen, that started after the 9/11, which I don't even know how many billions or trillions of dollars we lost since the 9/11 attack. And that $1 trillion that we've spent there is for naught. They've got riches there in the center of Afghanistan. I think 8 or 10 years ago, they announced gold, uranium, platinum, and all sorts of things. I haven't heard a word in years about that. I'd like to know if it was true, first of all. If it's true, what happened to all the money from that?
That's Michael in Cleveland. We'll stay in Cleveland. Bill, Democrat, go ahead.
Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, that $1 trillion, just throw it away out in smoke and all the people dying like that over there in Afghanistan. It's just, it just shows you what the world is really coming to.
say that you have all heard the discussions in the Security Council. I don't think I need to elaborate on what has transpired. I'm particularly grateful that the Secretary General found time to come and brief the Security Council. I think what he said was extremely important, and that is something which the Council members need to take back. You also heard that the Council members, they had reaffirmed the fact that we need immediate cessation of hostilities and violence. And I think there was also a sentiment among the Council members that for acceptance and legitimacy, there needs to be a political settlement. And that political settlement should fully respect the human rights of women, children, and minorities. And you've also heard the sentiments among the Council members on zero tolerance for terrorism. And the Secretary General unequivocally underlined this important aspect. And for all of us, the safety and security of the UN personnel, for the diplomatic and the consular staff, they are extremely important. And lastly, there was a great deal of sentiment where there was support for UNAMA and also support for the work they are doing, and also support for the safety and the security of UNAMA and UN personnel. So this is what I have to tell you. Thank you.
What about the recognition of new authorities in Afghanistan?
No, thank you very much. No, I just wanted to mention this. Thank you.
How the work is going on the state?
Thank you.
Are you coming out with a statement?
The discussions are on to see how best we can address some of the issues in the press statement. And we do sincerely hope that this will come out sooner rather than later. Thank you.
So that means today?
I really hope so. Thank you.
I'm speaking now in Estonia, together with Norway as the pen holders on Afghanistan. The Council has reached a press statement. It will be issued shortly. The main points of it are that we're calling for an immediate end to violence, restoration of security, civil and constitutional order. The Council will be expressing its deep concern about the serious violations in the country of humanitarian law and human rights abuses, and also focusing that all parties should allow immediate, safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and obviously recalling the support for the work of UNAMA. As I said, this is the pen holders letting you know what will be in the press statement. The press statement is on behalf of all the Council members. Thank you very much.
So no condemnation of the Taliban?